Robert Dudley became the center of the most vicious rumors in Europe when his first wife died with a broken neck. Foreign ambassadors continuously sent secret reports, suspecting him of staging this accident to clear the path to marry the English queen. The massive pressure from public opinion forced Queen Elizabeth I to cancel all wedding plans and completely strip his chance of becoming king. Despite not sharing the crown, he was still entrusted by the Queen with the greatest military positions of the Tudor era. He managed war fleets and built a vast intelligence network, but all military deployment decisions remained under the absolute control of the Queen. His life went from a wife-killing suspect to a powerful military pillar, but his survival and status always remained fully in the hands of the female head of state. The story of Robert Dudley actually begins with his grandfather, Edmund Dudley. In the 1490s, Edmund served King Henry VII as a strict financial official. He aggressively collected taxes and debts, making the king rich but the public furious. When Henry VIII became king in 1509, he needed to please the angry citizens. He arrested Edmund for treason and executed him in 1510. This execution proved that royal service offered great power but no permanent protection. Despite this, Edmund's son, John Dudley, successfully rebuilt the family's status. John used his military and political skills to rise through the royal court. He eventually became the Duke of Northumberland, acting as the most powerful man in England under the young King Edward VI. Robert Dudley was born on June 24, 1532. As his father reached the height of his power. He was the fifth son in a large household of 13 children. With several older brothers ahead of him, Robert knew he would not inherit the main family estates or titles. His future success depended completely on his own education, military skills, and personal connections. John Dudley prepared him carefully. Robert received a strong humanist education and studied under scholars associated with the English Renaissance, including Roger Ascham and John Dee. He learned Latin, French, and Italian. He also studied mathematics and navigation, subjects that had practical value in diplomacy, warfare, and overseas expansion. At the same time, he trained in the activities expected of a Tudor nobleman: riding, hunting, fencing, and military command. His education was not limited to books. Robert was placed close to the royal household and became a companion of Prince Edward, the future Edward VI. Through this position, he also knew Princess Elizabeth from an early age. The children of the Tudor court did not grow up in a safe or ordinary environment. Their families could rise or fall quickly, religious policy changed with each ruler, and accusations of treason could destroy entire households. Robert and Elizabeth both learned early that royal favor was powerful but unstable. That childhood connection later became one of the foundations of Robert's career. It did not mean that his future was secure. In fact, by the time he was 21, his family had reached the edge of destruction. King Edward VI became seriously ill in 1553. He had no children, and the legal heir was his half-sister, Mary Tudor. Mary was a committed Catholic, while Edward's government had pushed England further toward Protestantism. John Dudley believed that Mary's accession would reverse the religious settlement and remove the political network that supported his family. As Edward's condition worsened, John supported a new succession plan. The crown would pass not to Mary or Elizabeth, but to Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant noblewoman with Tudor blood. Jane was also married to John Dudley's son Guilford, making the plan closely connected to the Dudley family. After Edward died in July 1553, Jane was proclaimed queen. Robert Dudley was sent with approximately 300 cavalrymen to secure King's Lynn and help prevent Mary from gathering support. The operation failed. Mary avoided capture and attracted growing support from nobles, local forces, and ordinary people who viewed her as Henry VIII's lawful daughter and the legitimate heir. The government in London quickly changed sides. Jane Grey's reign collapsed after only a few days, and Mary entered the capital as queen. Robert was arrested on July 25, 1553. His father was executed the following month. His brother Guilford and Lady Jane Grey were executed in February 1554. Robert was tried for high treason at the Guildhall in January 1554 and convicted. The legal sentence for a male traitor was hanging, drawing, and quartering. His lands, status, and rights were taken from him, and he was imprisoned in the Tower of London. For Robert, the fall was almost total. He had grown up inside one of the most powerful families in England. Now his father was dead, one brother was awaiting execution, and the rest of the family had lost its property. Robert himself had no reason to assume that he would survive. During this same period, Princess Elizabeth also came under suspicion. In early 1554, Thomas Wyatt led a rebellion against Queen Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain. The rebellion was defeated, but the government suspected that Elizabeth, as the leading Protestant alternative to Mary, might have been involved or used as a figurehead. On March 18, 1554, Elizabeth was taken through Traitor's Gate and imprisoned in the Tower. Robert was being held in the Beauchamp Tower, while Elizabeth was confined nearby in the Bell Tower. High-ranking prisoners were sometimes allowed limited exercise, making it possible that they encountered each other during this period. While the exact details of their private conversations remain lost to history, their shared experience inside the tower created an unshakable bond. What is clear is that both were living under the threat of execution. Robert had seen his family destroyed for attempting to control the succession. Elizabeth knew that her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been executed when she was a child, and she now faced the possibility that Mary's government might treat her as another political threat. Their later closeness cannot be explained only by romance or personal attraction. They shared an understanding of political danger that few others at court possessed. Both had survived imprisonment. Both knew how quickly accusations could become death sentences. When Elizabeth later became queen, Robert was not simply an attractive courtier from her youth. He was someone who had experienced the same machinery of suspicion, imprisonment, and possible execution. Robert's release did not come immediately. His mother, Jane Dudley, worked to save her surviving sons by appealing to influential Spanish nobles connected to Philip of Spain. One important contact was Diego Mendoza, who had family links to the Dudleys through Guilford. These efforts helped secure the release of Robert and his brothers late in 1554. Though they walked out of the Tower alive, the Crown had already seized their family property. The Dudley name remained associated with rebellion and the failed attempt to place Jane Grey on the throne. Robert needed to rebuild his position through service. He and his brother Henry joined the Anglo-Spanish campaign against France. At the Battle of St. Quentin in 1557, Robert served in military operations and gained experience with artillery and logistics. The campaign also brought another family loss. Henry Dudley was killed during the fighting, reportedly struck by a cannonball. The surviving brothers had now demonstrated loyalty to Queen Mary through active military service. Parliament eventually lifted the legal penalties against the family, restoring their status. Robert was no longer formally condemned as the son of an attainted traitor, but his financial recovery depended heavily on a marriage he had made before the family's collapse. On June 4, 1550, Robert had married Amy Robsart at Sheen Palace. King Edward VI attended the ceremony. Amy was the daughter and heir of Sir John Robsart, a wealthy Norfolk landowner whose income came from agriculture and large sheep holdings. For Robert, a younger son without a guaranteed inheritance, the marriage offered financial security. Amy's property became especially important after Robert's release from prison. Revenue from her estates helped support the couple and allowed Robert to rebuild his public role. The marriage appears to have been functional during its early years, although it produced no children. Everything changed when Queen Mary died in November 1558 and Elizabeth became queen. Robert immediately returned to the center of royal government. Elizabeth appointed him Master of the Horse, one of the most important offices in the royal household. The role gave him responsibility for the Queen's horses, stables, transport, and the organization of royal travel. More importantly, it gave him regular physical access to Elizabeth. Tudor court life was controlled by rank, ceremony, and access. Most officials could approach the Queen only through formal channels. Robert rode beside her during hunting and royal progresses. He assisted her when she mounted or dismounted. He could speak with her for long periods outside meetings of the Privy Council. This access translated into political influence. Robert could recommend appointments, defend allies, answer accusations, and present his views before other officials had the opportunity to shape the discussion. He did not yet control the government, but he occupied a position that many older nobles considered dangerous. His most important political rival was William Cecil, Elizabeth's principal secretary. Cecil relied on documents, committees, ambassadors, and intelligence reports. Robert relied on personal access and the Queen's confidence. Elizabeth used both men. Cecil provided administrative discipline, while Robert offered military knowledge, court management, and personal loyalty. Their competition also helped prevent either one from becoming fully dominant. Robert's rise created another problem. He was married, but his wife rarely appeared at court. Amy remained mainly at country houses, while Robert spent most of his time near the Queen. Foreign ambassadors and English courtiers began reporting that Elizabeth showed him exceptional favor. Rumors spread that the Queen might eventually marry him. For Robert, such a marriage would have represented the highest possible achievement. The son of an executed traitor would become the husband of the Queen. Yet Amy remained alive, and Tudor England did not permit him simply to end the marriage for political convenience. By 1560, the situation had become public enough to attract attention across Europe. Catholic diplomats already questioned Elizabeth's legitimacy and watched for any scandal that might weaken her position. English nobles feared that marriage to Robert would elevate the Dudley family above the traditional aristocracy. Any unexplained change in Amy's condition would therefore be examined politically, not merely as a private matter. On Sunday, September 8, 1560, Amy was staying at Cumnor Place in Oxfordshire. That morning she insisted that the household servants leave to attend a local fair at Abingdon. According to later testimony, she pressed them to go even when some objected. The result was that the house became unusually empty. When the servants returned that evening, they found Amy dead at the bottom of a surprisingly short staircase. Her neck was broken, and she had wounds on her head. There were no witnesses inside the house who could explain how she had fallen. Robert received the news while at Windsor. He immediately understood that his wife's death could destroy him. Instead of traveling to Cumnor Place, he remained at court and sent his trusted servant Thomas Blount to ensure that an official investigation was conducted. A coroner's jury was assembled. The body was examined. The household was questioned. Robert demanded that the inquiry be thorough, but the political damage had already begun. Before the jury announced any verdict, the central question was spreading through England and the courts of Europe. Had Amy Robsart died in an accident, taken her own life, or been removed because she stood between Robert Dudley and the throne? The official investigation into Amy Robsart's death did not produce evidence of murder. The coroner, Arthur Kelway, led a jury of 15 local men who examined the body, questioned members of the household, and considered the physical condition of the staircase where she had been found. Their findings were unusually specific. Amy had suffered a broken neck. There were 2 wounds on the top of her head, one shallow and another, approximately 2 inches deep. Yet the rest of her body showed none of the injuries normally associated with a violent attack or a prolonged fall. There was no widespread bruising, no clear sign of a struggle, and no damage to her hands suggesting that she had tried to defend herself. Her headdress was reportedly still in place. The jury eventually concluded that Amy had died accidentally. According to the verdict, she had fallen down the staircase and suffered fatal injuries. Legally, Robert Dudley had been cleared. Politically, the verdict changed very little. The first problem was the timing. Amy died at the precise moment when much of the court believed Robert might marry the Queen. Any death under those circumstances would have appeared suspicious, even if it had occurred in public. The deliberate isolation of that day made the event almost impossible to separate from rumor. The mystery of Amy's death immediately spawned competing narratives. The most grounded medical explanation pointed to an accident caused by serious illness. Modern medical analyses suggest Amy may have suffered from advanced breast cancer. The disease could have metastasized to her spine, making her neck bone so brittle that even a minor stumble down a short staircase could prove fatal. That explanation would account for the broken neck, the limited head wounds, and the lack of major injuries elsewhere on Amy's body. A second, darker explanation suggests suicide. Amy may have known that she was seriously ill. She was living away from her husband while Europe openly discussed his relationship with Elizabeth. Her marriage had once provided Robert with financial survival, but after Elizabeth became queen, Amy had been left mainly in the countryside while her husband occupied the most privileged position at court. Supporters of the suicide theory point to her insistence that the servants leave Cumnor Place. She may have wanted the house empty because she intended to take her own life. Some have also suggested that she understood what her death would do to Robert. Whether intended or not, her death destroyed his immediate chances of marrying Elizabeth. However, the accusation that spread most effectively was direct assassination. The claim that Robert ordered her murder. This was simple, dramatic, and politically useful. Robert wanted to marry the Queen. His wife was the main legal obstacle. Amy died alone. Therefore, his enemies claimed that he had arranged her removal. There was never direct evidence connecting him to a murder. By remaining at Windsor and dispatching a trusted agent to oversee the inquiry, Dudley attempted to preserve the investigation's integrity, though it did little to quell public suspicion. He repeatedly demanded a complete inquiry. The political logic of murder was also weak. Robert understood court politics too well to assume that Amy's sudden death would clear his path to the throne. It was far more likely to destroy him. A quiet divorce, a long illness, or a death witnessed by multiple people might have created a possible route toward remarriage. A mysterious death in an empty house created the worst possible circumstances. A final scenario shifts the blame entirely, suggesting that one of Robert's political enemies arranged the death. William Cecil and other political figures had strong reasons to prevent Robert from becoming king consort. A scandal involving the death of his wife could permanently damage him without requiring his removal from office. If someone wanted to separate Robert from Elizabeth, Amy's unexplained death achieved that result. No reliable evidence has proved that Cecil or another faction ordered the killing. The theory survives because the outcome clearly benefited Robert's opponents. He remained close to Elizabeth, but he became almost impossible to present as an acceptable royal husband. The consequences reached far beyond personal reputation. England in 1560 was politically fragile. Elizabeth had been queen for less than 2 years. Her legitimacy remained disputed by Catholic powers. France and Spain watched English politics closely, while Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, possessed a strong hereditary claim to the English throne. If Elizabeth married a man suspected of murdering his wife, the marriage could be used to attack the moral and political legitimacy of the entire regime. Members of the English nobility made their opposition clear. Several were prepared to resist Dudley's elevation because they viewed him as an ambitious newcomer from a family already associated with treason. His father had attempted to alter the succession in 1553. Now Robert appeared to be moving toward the throne through the Queen's personal favor. Some nobles warned that they would not accept him as king consort. The threat of organized resistance was serious enough that Elizabeth could not dismiss it as court gossip. Foreign diplomats made the situation worse. The Spanish ambassador Álvaro de la Cuadra reported the scandal to his government. French observers also followed the investigation closely. Catholic opponents could now portray England as a kingdom ruled by a queen, preparing to marry the suspected killer of his own wife. Mary Stuart reportedly mocked Elizabeth by saying that the English queen planned to marry her horsekeeper after he had killed his wife. The insult reduced Robert from a senior court official to a servant and transformed Elizabeth's possible marriage into an international scandal. Elizabeth responded by temporarily distancing herself from him. Robert was removed from the center of court life and sent to Kew while the investigation continued. This did not mean that Elizabeth believed he was guilty. It meant that she understood how dangerous his presence had become. The Queen had spent her entire life surviving threats created by questions of marriage legitimacy and succession. She knew that personal confidence was not enough. A royal marriage needed acceptance from Parliament, the Privy Council, the nobility, and foreign allies. Robert no longer had that acceptance. Even after the jury returned a verdict of accidental death, the suspicion did not disappear. Elizabeth could restore him to office, but she could not erase the rumors. She made the practical decision not to marry him. For Robert, this was the central limit placed on his ambition. He could remain the Queen's favorite, influence policy, gain titles, and build wealth. But he could not become her husband without risking rebellion and international isolation. Elizabeth compensated him in other ways. On September 28, 1564, Robert was created Baron Denbigh. The following day, he became Earl of Leicester. The elevation gave him a formal place among the highest nobility and helped answer those who dismissed him as merely a household servant. The grant included Kenilworth Castle and extensive estates in the Midlands and Wales. Kenilworth became the physical center of Robert's power. It was not simply a residence. It was a fortified estate, an administrative headquarters, and a symbol that he had survived the destruction of his family. A decade earlier, he had left the Tower of London with almost nothing. Now he controlled one of the most important castles in England. The title also helped Elizabeth manage court politics. Robert's influence had long exceeded his formal rank. By making him an earl, she gave his authority a legal and social foundation. At the same time, she could present the elevation as a substitute for marriage rather than a step toward it. Soon afterward, Elizabeth and William Cecil developed another plan for him. They proposed that Robert marry Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. The proposal appears surprising because Mary was Catholic. Robert was a committed Protestant, and the two had no established personal relationship. But the plan made political sense from the English perspective. Mary Stuart had a claim to the English throne and was a possible focus for Catholic opposition. If she married a foreign prince, especially one connected to France or Spain, Scotland could become a direct military threat. If she married Robert, Elizabeth would place one of her most loyal servants beside the Scottish Queen. Robert could influence Scottish policy, restrain Mary's alliances, and protect English interests. His presence in Scotland might also reduce the danger of a Catholic succession movement developing around Mary. The proposal offered Elizabeth another advantage. It would remove Robert from the English court. His access to the Queen had caused resentment for years. Sending him to Scotland would weaken his personal faction in London and reduce public discussion of their relationship. It would also give him a crown of his own, though only through marriage. Robert did not welcome the plan. Scotland offered prestige, but it also carried major risks. Mary's government was divided. The country faced conflict between Protestant nobles and Catholic supporters. Robert would have entered a court where many viewed him as an English agent and others regarded him as a suspected wife murderer. However, Robert recognized the political trap. Accepting the Scottish crown meant forfeiting the very foundation of his power, unfiltered proximity to Elizabeth. He understood that true influence came not from empty titles, but from daily physical access. At the English court, he could shape appointments, defend allies, and intercept hostile policies in private before they ever reached the Privy Council. In Scotland, isolated among a hostile nobility and dependent on Mary's cooperation, that leverage would vanish entirely. He therefore undermined the proposal without openly defying Elizabeth. During negotiations with Scottish representatives, Robert showed little enthusiasm. He raised demands concerning authority, money, and political status that made the arrangement more difficult. He allowed Mary's government to see that he did not consider the match desirable. Mary was already insulted by the offer. From her perspective, Elizabeth was asking a crowned queen to marry one of her own subjects, a man still associated with the mysterious death of his first wife. Accepting Robert could be interpreted as admitting that Mary's rank was lower than Elizabeth's. In 1565, the proposal failed. Robert remained in England, exactly where he wanted to be. By then, he understood that he needed a new model of power. Marriage to Elizabeth was no longer a realistic objective. He could not depend entirely on affection or court access because both could be withdrawn. He therefore began constructing a broader political network that reached into education, religion, trade, exploration, culture, and regional military power. His position at Oxford University became one of the foundations of that network. In 1564, Robert was appointed Chancellor of Oxford. The office gave him influence over appointments, university discipline, and the religious direction of one of England's most important educational institutions. The universities trained many of the clergy, administrators, legal officials, and political advisors who would later serve the crown. Controlling appointments at Oxford therefore gave Robert influence over the future personnel of the English state. He used the position aggressively. Catholic sympathizers came under pressure, while students and faculty were required to demonstrate loyalty to the Protestant settlement. Robert supported scholars and ministers who wanted the English Church to move further away from Catholic traditions. This placed him in a complicated position. Elizabeth supported Protestant rule but disliked religious extremism. She wanted uniformity and obedience, not independent reform movements that challenged royal control. Robert, however, protected several more radical Protestant figures when church officials attempted to silence them. One of the best known was Thomas Cartwright, a Puritan theologian who criticized the structure of the Church of England. Robert did not agree with every radical demand, but he recognized the political value of becoming the protector of committed Protestants. This gave him supporters beyond the royal household. Clergymen, scholars, local officials, and Protestant activists increasingly looked to Leicester as their defender at court. His religious network also strengthened his foreign policy position. Robert believed England should support Protestant movements in Scotland, France, and the Netherlands. He saw the struggle against Catholic powers not only as a religious conflict, but as a strategic necessity. If Spain or France eliminated Protestant resistance abroad, England could become isolated. Robert also expanded his economic interests. He received valuable commercial privileges, including rights connected to the import of sweet wines and the export of undyed woolen cloth. These monopolies produced income that did not depend entirely on grants of land. They also connected his household to merchants, customs officials, shipowners, and financiers. He invested in the Muscovy Company, which developed English trade with Russia. The company sought direct access to markets beyond the traditional routes controlled by European competitors. English merchants exported cloth and imported goods such as furs, wax, timber, and other northern products. Robert's interest in overseas trade was not separate from his political ambition. Commercial ventures created money, intelligence, and relationships. Merchants supplied information about foreign ports, military preparations, diplomatic changes, and new markets. a nobleman who financed overseas expeditions, gained access to knowledge that ordinary courtiers did not possess. He also supported Martin Frobisher's attempts to find a northwest passage to Asia. The voyages were expensive and dangerous, and their commercial results were uncertain. Yet they reflected a wider strategy. England needed new trade routes and maritime experience if it wanted to compete with Spain and Portugal. Robert was beginning to move beyond the role of royal favorite. He was developing independent sources of revenue and building connections with the people who would shape England's future expansion. The most profitable of those connections would eventually involve Francis Drake. But before Robert could fully develop his overseas network, he needed to secure his public image, display his wealth, and remind the Queen that no other subject could match the scale of his service. Kenilworth Castle became the stage on which he attempted to do exactly that. Kenilworth Castle was more than Robert Dudley's principal residence. It was the clearest demonstration of what he had become. The ruined son of an executed traitor had rebuilt himself into one of the richest and most influential nobles in England. Dudley transformed the medieval fortress into a large Renaissance palace suitable for receiving the Queen. He expanded the residential buildings, improved the gardens, created elaborate decorative spaces, and prepared the estate to accommodate hundreds of guests. The work served several purposes. Kenilworth displayed his wealth, strengthened his authority in the Midlands, and provided a place where he could entertain Elizabeth beyond the restrictive atmosphere of the royal court. The most famous visit occurred in the summer of 1575. Elizabeth stayed at Kenilworth for 19 days, an unusually long royal visit. Dudley organized a program of hunting, music, fireworks, plays, water displays, banquets, and carefully arranged public ceremonies. A temporary bridge leading into the castle was decorated with mythological scenes and gifts. Performers presented speeches that praised Elizabeth while also making indirect references to marriage. Historical estimates suggest Dudley spent an enormous sum on the entertainment, potentially reaching an unprecedented £60,000. Even allowing for later exaggeration, the event consumed a major part of his income. The festival is often described as his final attempt to persuade Elizabeth to marry him. That interpretation is possible, but it was not the only purpose. Dudley also needed to demonstrate that he remained the Queen's most important noble servant, despite the scandal surrounding Amy Robsart's death. Foreign ambassadors, courtiers, local officials, and members of the nobility all observed the visit. The scale of the entertainment sent a clear political message. Dudley possessed the resources, organization, and regional authority expected of a great magnate. He was no longer simply the Queen's companion or master of the horse. Elizabeth enjoyed the visit, but she made no commitment to marriage. By 1575, both of them understood the political limits surrounding their relationship. Dudley could continue to occupy a privileged emotional and political position, but he was unlikely to become king consort. Kenilworth therefore became less a proposal of marriage than a public statement of permanent importance. Dudley also invested heavily in cultural patronage. He supported musicians, writers, scholars, and actors. His household included educated secretaries and men with connections to the expanding literary world of Elizabethan England. His most important theatrical project was the acting company known as Leicester's Men. Professional actors faced serious legal difficulties in 16th century England. Authorities often treated traveling performers as vagabonds unless they could show that they belonged to the household of a noble patron. Local governments, especially officials in London, feared that public performances encouraged disorder, spread disease, and attracted crowds that were difficult to control. Dudley placed a group of actors under his protection and used his influence to secure a royal patent for them in 1574. The document allowed Leicester's Men to perform throughout the country, subject to certain restrictions, and gave them a stronger legal position than earlier traveling companies had enjoyed. The patent did not create English theater by itself, but it helped establish a workable model for professional acting companies. Performers could operate under noble patronage, receive royal authorization, and earn money from public audiences. 2 years later, James Burbage, a leading member of Leicester's men, constructed a permanent playhouse outside the jurisdiction of the City of London. It became known simply as the Theatre. Burbage's son Richard would later become one of the most important actors associated with William Shakespeare. Dudley did not finance Shakespeare directly, but his intervention helped create the legal and commercial environment in which professional English theater developed. His cultural influence therefore extended far beyond court entertainment at Kenilworth. The same method appeared throughout his career. Dudley used personal access to the Queen to obtain legal privileges. He then used those privileges to build organizations that could operate beyond the immediate court. He followed a similar strategy in overseas trade and maritime expansion. Dudley invested in Francis Drake's voyage around the world, which began in 1577. Drake's official purpose was never stated openly because the expedition entered regions claimed by Spain. In practice, the voyage combined exploration, trade, private warfare, and the seizure of Spanish property. Drake sailed through the Strait of Magellan and entered the Pacific, where Spanish settlements and ships were poorly prepared for an English attack. He captured valuable cargoes, including silver, gold, jewels, and spices. When Drake returned to England in 1580, the financial return for his investors was extraordinary. The exact figures remain disputed, but the profits were large enough to transform the fortunes of those involved. Dudley was among the most important supporters of the expedition. The voyage also had strategic value. Drake brought back information about Spanish ports, navigation routes, coastal defenses, and global trade. England had gained practical knowledge that would later become useful in its naval conflict with Spain. Supporting Drake carried political risks. Spain considered him a pirate, while Elizabeth avoided publicly admitting that the Crown had authorized his attacks. Dudley's participation gave the Queen a useful degree of separation. Private investors could finance operations that served English interests without requiring Parliament to declare war. Dudley's commercial activities also gave him relationships with merchants and seamen who did not belong to the traditional aristocracy. His political network included university officials, Protestant ministers, actors, military officers, regional landowners, and overseas investors. He maintained his own channels of information as well. William Cecil had built an extensive administrative and intelligence system around the offices of Secretary of State and the Privy Council. Dudley could not easily compete with Cecil in written government. Instead, he relied on household servants, military contacts, foreign Protestants, merchants, diplomats, and clients placed throughout the country. His estates gave him additional power. As Earl of Leicester, he controlled large areas and could call on armed retainers loyal to his household. The bear and ragged staff, the Dudley family emblem, appeared on uniforms, buildings, and property connected to his authority. This did not make him independent of the crown. Elizabeth could still remove him from office or confiscate his possessions, but it meant that his position was supported by more than the Queen's personal affection. Yet one major problem remained unresolved. Dudley had no legitimate heir. His marriage to Amy Robsart had produced no children. After her death, he had spent years avoiding another public marriage because Elizabeth reacted badly whenever her closest male courtiers formed relationships outside her control. Remaining unmarried also helped maintain Dudley's special position as the Queen's most devoted companion. Privately, however, he became involved with Douglas Sheffield, the widow of John Sheffield, Baron Sheffield. Their relationship lasted for several years and resulted in the birth of a son in 1574. The boy was named Robert Dudley after his father. Dudley recognized him and took an interest in his upbringing. The younger Robert later became a skilled navigator and explorer. But he was not accepted as a legitimate heir. Douglas Sheffield later claimed that she and Dudley had been secretly married. Dudley denied this. No conclusive documentation has survived proving that a valid marriage occurred. Dudley's refusal to recognize such a marriage was consistent with his political situation. A secret wife would have created another conflict with Elizabeth, while a public wife would have ended any remaining possibility that the Queen might choose him. The son's illegitimacy meant that he could not inherit the earldom or Dudley's major aristocratic titles. As Dudley entered middle age, the continuation of his family line became a serious concern. He eventually selected Lettice Knollys as his second wife. Lettice was the widow of Walter Devereux, Earl of Essex, who had died in Ireland in 1576. She came from a powerful Protestant family and was related to Elizabeth through the Boleyn line. Her mother, Catherine Carey, was the daughter of Mary Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's sister. Lettice had already produced several children during her first marriage. For Dudley, this made her a practical choice. She offered high birth, political connections, and a strong likelihood of providing a legitimate heir. She also physically resembled Elizabeth. Contemporary observers described Lettice as attractive, with features associated with the Boleyn family. The resemblance may have made the relationship particularly offensive to the Queen. On September 21, 1578, Dudley and Lettice were married at Wanstead. The ceremony was deliberately private. Only a small number of relatives and trusted associates attended, including Dudley's brother Ambrose and Lettice's father, Francis Knollys. The secrecy showed that Dudley expected Elizabeth to react badly. He had spent years presenting himself as permanently devoted to her. Marriage to one of her own relatives, without royal permission, challenged both her personal expectations and her authority as head of the court. Dudley did not immediately tell her. For months he continued his normal role beside the Queen, while keeping the marriage concealed. This was difficult because noble marriages created legal, financial, and household arrangements that could not remain hidden indefinitely. The truth emerged during a separate dispute over Elizabeth's own marriage negotiations. By the late 1570s, Elizabeth was considering a match with Francis, Duke of Anjou, the younger brother of the French king. The proposal divided the English court. Supporters believed an alliance with France could protect England against Spain. Opponents feared a Catholic husband, French influence, and possible religious disorder. Dudley strongly opposed the marriage. His objections were political as well as personal. A French royal husband would reduce his influence and potentially remove him from the center of power. The French ambassador Jean de Simière became one of the leading promoters of the Anjou match. Simière understood that Dudley was a major obstacle. He also possessed an effective network for collecting court information. In 1579, Simière informed Elizabeth that Dudley had secretly married Lettice Knollys. The revelation turned a private marriage into an act of political deception. Elizabeth was furious. Dudley had married a woman of royal blood without permission, concealed the relationship, and continued to appear before the Queen as though nothing had changed. She considered sending him to the Tower. William Cecil reportedly helped prevent the punishment from going that far, partly because Dudley remained an important military figure, and partly because an open attack on him could divide the court. Dudley was temporarily excluded from royal favor and placed under restrictions. He eventually returned because Elizabeth still needed his experience and because their political partnership had become deeply embedded in the government. The marriage, nevertheless, changed their relationship. Elizabeth never accepted Lettice. She excluded her from court and refused to allow her the public position normally expected of the wife of an earl. Lettice could manage Dudley's households and live on his estates, but she could not appear freely in the Queen's presence. Elizabeth reportedly called her a she-wolf and continued to treat her with hostility for the rest of the reign. Dudley now lived between two separate households. His official life remained centered on Elizabeth and the royal court. His private family life existed with Lettuce, often at Wanstead or Kenilworth. The arrangement did not end his political career, but the unquestioned personal trust of their earlier years had been damaged. Elizabeth continued to consult him, promote him, quarrel with him, and depend on him. Their relationship became less idealized and more openly difficult. The marriage achieved one of Dudley's main objectives. In 1581, Lettuce gave birth to a son. The child was named Robert and received the courtesy title Lord Denbigh. For the first time, Dudley had a legitimate male heir who could inherit his titles and estates. He invested enormous hope in the boy. After decades of rebuilding the Dudley name, he could now imagine transferring his political network, property, and rank to another generation. That hope lasted only 3 years. Lord Denbigh died in 1584. The cause is uncertain, but childhood mortality remained high even in wealthy households. Dudley arranged an elaborate tomb for his son in the collegiate church at Warwick. The inscription emphasized the child's noble ancestry and his position as the heir of Leicester. It also revealed the scale of Dudley's loss. He had wealth, royal favor, estates, offices, and political clients, but no surviving legitimate son. His illegitimate child by Douglas Sheffield remained alive, but Dudley did not alter his legal status. The earldom of Leicester would therefore die with him unless another legitimate son was born. Personal loss did not reduce Dudley's public responsibilities. During the same period, relations between England and Spain were deteriorating rapidly. The conflict centered increasingly on the Netherlands. The Dutch provinces were ruled by Philip II of Spain, but Protestant rebels had been fighting Spanish authority for years. The revolt involved religion, taxation, provincial rights, and resistance to foreign military occupation. Dudley had long argued that England should support the Dutch Protestants. If Spain regained complete control over the Netherlands, Spanish forces would possess major ports directly across the North Sea from England. That would place the English coast and the Thames under greater military pressure. Elizabeth hesitated to intervene openly. Direct support for the rebels risked war with Philip II. She preferred limited assistance, private financing, and diplomacy. By 1585, the situation had become more dangerous. Spanish forces under the Duke of Parma captured Antwerp, one of the most important cities in northern Europe. The possibility that Spain might defeat the Dutch revolt now appeared real. Elizabeth responded with the Treaty of Nonsuch. England agreed to send soldiers and money to assist the Dutch provinces. Dudley was appointed commander of the expeditionary force. For years, he had promoted Protestant intervention abroad. He was now given the opportunity to carry it out. He arrived in the Netherlands with English troops, but the campaign immediately exposed the limits of his authority. The Dutch expected stronger protection than Elizabeth intended to provide. English soldiers lacked reliable supplies and pay. Local political factions disagreed over military strategy, while Spanish forces were experienced and well organized. Dudley believed he needed a clear political position to command effectively. In 1586, the Dutch States General offered him the title of Governor-General. He accepted. Elizabeth had not authorized him to take sovereign authority in the Netherlands. She had sent him as her military representative, not as the independent ruler of the Dutch provinces. When news reached England, she reacted with intense anger. She believed Dudley had exceeded his orders and placed her in a position that looked like a direct seizure of Philip II's territory. Dudley defended himself by arguing that the title was necessary to coordinate the war. Without recognized authority, he could not control Dutch officials, English commanders, or military finances. The explanation did not satisfy Elizabeth. Their correspondence became openly hostile. She criticized his judgment, delayed support, and made it clear that his power came entirely from her commission. The Dutch campaign continued, but shortages, divided command, and political interference limited its success. Dudley discovered that commanding an international coalition was far more difficult than organizing a royal household or managing his own estates. He returned to England in 1587 with his reputation damaged, though not destroyed. The larger strategic warning remained unchanged. Spain was preparing for a direct confrontation, and England's support for the Dutch rebels, Francis Drake's attacks on Spanish shipping, and Elizabeth's execution of Mary Stuart had made a peaceful settlement increasingly unlikely. Dudley had failed to achieve a decisive result in the Netherlands. He would soon face a much greater responsibility at home. Spain was assembling an invasion fleet. By 1588, the conflict between England and Spain had moved beyond diplomacy, privateering, and indirect intervention in the Netherlands. Philip II was preparing a full invasion of England. The Spanish plan required two forces to work together. The Armada would sail through the English Channel, defeat or contain the English fleet, and secure control of the sea. It would then connect with the Duke of Parma's army in the Netherlands. Parma's experienced troops would cross the Channel, land in England, advance toward London, and remove Elizabeth from power. The scale of the threat forced the English government to prepare for war on land as well as at sea. Even if the navy damaged the Armada, Spanish troops might still reach the English coast. The defense of London therefore depended on organizing militia, supplies, transport, fortifications, and command structures across southern England. Elizabeth appointed Robert Dudley commander-in-chief of the land forces. The decision showed that his failed Dutch campaign had not ended his military importance. Elizabeth had criticized his judgment in the Netherlands, but she still considered him one of the few nobles capable of coordinating a national defense. Dudley had experience with artillery, cavalry, military logistics, regional administration, and the movement of large royal households. These skills were directly relevant to the emergency. He was also politically reliable. In the event of an invasion, the commander responsible for protecting London would control thousands of armed men. Elizabeth needed someone whose loyalty she did not question. Dudley concentrated the main defensive force at Tilbury on the north bank of the River Thames. The position was strategically important because it guarded the river route leading toward London. If Spanish vessels or transport ships entered the Thames, they could threaten the capital directly. Tilbury also offered a place where English troops could respond to a landing in Essex or move toward other threatened areas. Dudley established defensive works, organized camps, and attempted to bring order to militia units arriving from different counties. The English land forces were not a single professional army. Many soldiers were local militiamen with limited training. They carried different weapons, wore uneven equipment, and depended on local authorities for food, wages, and transport. Some units arrived without sufficient powder, weapons, or supplies. Dudley repeatedly warned the government that poor provisioning could destroy morale before the enemy appeared. He used his own credit and resources to help secure food and advance wages. He also pressured officials to improve the delivery of weapons and ammunition. His experience in the Netherlands had shown him the consequences of unpaid troops. Soldiers without food or wages became undisciplined, deserted, or turned against the population they were supposed to defend. At Tilbury, he attempted to avoid the same failure. Engineers prepared earthworks and defensive positions. Plans were made to obstruct the Thames, including the use of chains and other barriers against hostile shipping. Cavalry units were placed where they could respond to a breakthrough, while infantry forces were organized to protect the approaches to London. The government did not know where the Spanish would land. Reports arrived from coastal towns, naval commanders, merchants, and local officials. Many were incomplete or contradictory. Dudley had to prepare for several possibilities at once. The first major encounters occurred at sea. The Armada entered the English Channel in late July 1588. English ships followed and attacked from a distance, using greater maneuverability and long-range gunnery. The Spanish fleet remained largely intact as it moved toward Calais, where it expected to connect with Parma. That connection never occurred. Parma's troops were not ready to embark, and Dutch vessels controlled the shallow coastal waters. English fireships then disrupted the Spanish formation at Calais, forcing the Armada to break its defensive arrangement. The following battle near Gravelines damaged several Spanish ships and pushed the fleet northward. The Armada could no longer carry out the original invasion plan. It began a long return journey around Scotland and Ireland, where storms, navigational problems, and shortages caused further losses. The naval danger was declining, but the government did not immediately know that the invasion had failed. Communication was slow, and the Spanish fleet remained at sea. English leaders still had to assume that Parma's army might cross, or that surviving ships could return. Dudley therefore arranged for Elizabeth to visit the troops at Tilbury. The visit served a military and political purpose. Thousands of men had gathered to defend a queen most had never seen. A personal appearance could strengthen morale and demonstrate that Elizabeth had not withdrawn to safety while others faced the invasion. There were serious risks. The camp contained armed men, disease, poor sanitation, and uncertain security. If Spanish forces landed unexpectedly, the Queen could be exposed. Some counselors advised against the visit. Dudley supported it and helped organize the event. On August 8, Elizabeth traveled to the area. The following day, she appeared before the assembled troops. She wore light-colored clothing and a silver breastplate and rode among the soldiers on horseback. Dudley remained close beside her. As master of the horse and commander of the army, his position was both practical and symbolic. He managed the Queen's movement through the camp and provided immediate protection. His presence also represented the connection between the crown and the military command. Elizabeth delivered the speech later associated with the phrase that she had the heart and stomach of a king. The exact wording may have been recorded and polished afterward, but the central message reflected the purpose of the visit. She presented herself as willing to share the danger faced by her subjects and promised rewards for their service. Dudley was publicly identified as the commander who would act on her behalf. This was one of the highest levels of authority she ever gave to a subject. The scene at Tilbury also revealed how far their relationship had developed. They had known each other as children, survived imprisonment during Mary's reign, and spent 3 decades navigating court rivalry, marriage negotiations, personal conflict, and political crisis. Elizabeth had once considered sending Dudley to the Tower after discovering his secret marriage. She had openly condemned his conduct in the Netherlands. Yet when England faced invasion, she placed the land defense in his hands. The Armada did not land troops in England. The danger gradually passed as reports confirmed that the Spanish fleet had sailed north and was attempting to return home. The victory became one of the defining events of Elizabeth's reign. It strengthened the government, weakened the immediate threat of invasion, and supported the image of England as a Protestant kingdom protected against a larger Catholic power. Dudley's role was less visible than that of the naval commanders because no major land battle occurred. He did not defeat Spanish troops at Tilbury. His responsibility was to prepare for a battle that never happened. That did not make the work unnecessary. England could not know in advance that the Armada would fail to connect with Parma. The organization of the land forces reduced the danger that a successful Spanish landing would meet no coordinated resistance. The campaign was also Dudley's final major service. By the summer of 1588, his health was poor. Contemporary accounts suggest that he suffered from recurring fever, possibly malaria, although other illnesses have also been proposed. Some later writers suggested stomach cancer, The surviving evidence does not allow a certain diagnosis. Years of court service, military campaigns, travel, and administrative pressure had weakened him. The conditions at Tilbury may have made the illness worse. Large military camps were unhealthy environments, with contaminated water, poor sanitation, and infectious disease. After the invasion threat declined, Dudley left the camp. He planned to travel to the thermal baths at Buxton, where he hoped the mineral waters might improve his condition. He did not reach them. On September 4, 1588, Dudley died at Cornbury Park in Oxfordshire. He was 56 years old. His death came less than a month after Elizabeth's appearance at Tilbury. The man who had stood beside her during the public celebration of national resistance was suddenly gone. Dudley had written to Elizabeth shortly before his death. The surviving letter was brief and practical. He expressed concern for her health and referred to his own condition. It did not contain a final political statement or a dramatic farewell. Elizabeth later marked the document with the words, "His last letter." She kept it among her private possessions until her death in 1603. Reports of her immediate reaction must be treated carefully because later accounts often exaggerated royal grief. However, there is little doubt that Dudley's death affected her deeply. He had been part of her personal and political life for most of her reign. For nearly 30 years, he had occupied a position no other man fully replaced. He was a childhood acquaintance, a fellow survivor of the Tower, a possible husband, a political ally, a source of repeated frustration, and one of her most important military servants. Their relationship had never remained entirely private. Foreign governments studied it. English nobles feared it. Protestant activists used Dudley's protection, while his enemies treated his access to the Queen as evidence of corruption. Elizabeth had refused to marry him, but she also refused to remove him permanently from power. Even after serious conflicts, she continued to restore him to office because his value outweighed the personal damage. Dudley's death triggered the immediate collapse of his personal empire. Owing the crown the massive sum of £50,000, Elizabeth did not cancel the debt because of personal grief. Without a legitimate heir to shield his legacy, the earldom of Leicester vanished with him. His surviving wife, Lettice, remained permanently exiled from the court, while the crown swiftly dismantled the vast empire he had built around Kenilworth to recover his massive debts. Her son from her first marriage, Robert Devereux, inherited part of Dudley's political position but ultimately failed to manage the limits of royal favor and was executed in 1601. Over time, Dudley's historical reputation suffered greatly from hostile accounts. Propaganda, such as the publication Leicester's Commonwealth, portrayed him as a highly corrupt political manipulator. These texts claimed he ruthlessly eliminated his rivals to gain power. His adversaries widely circulated this negative image across Europe. Consequently, many historians note that his actual legacy was largely overshadowed by intense political scandal. Yet, the institutions and movements he financed continued to shape England. Oxford remained an important center of Protestant education. English merchants expanded their overseas operations through the Muscovy Company and Drake's global maritime expansion. His patronage secured the legal foundation for the professional companies that would define Shakespearean theater. He turned personal access to Elizabeth into a network that supported the religious, military, commercial, and cultural priorities of her entire reign. Robert Dudley was never the hidden ruler of England, nor was he merely a decorative favorite. He was a deeply flawed, ambitious operator who built the very infrastructure of the Elizabethan age through sheer personal influence. He constructed the foundations of a golden era, yet history remembers him primarily as a wife-murdering opportunist condemned by the world. Did Robert Dudley build the greatest triumphs of the Tudor age, only to be written out of its glory by the exact rumors that kept him from the throne?